Hello, all you positive heads out there. It's so good to be back with all you beautiful reflections of the one source consciousness that creates and animates all things. If you're new to this podcast, of course, we are super happy to have you here, and we just ask that you bring an open mind and heart to your listening experience and to be prepared to explore vantage points that I'm convinced will help shift or solidify your current understanding of the ultimate nature of reality in a way that is extremely empowering. Speaking of exploring powerful perspectives, I'm super excited to announce the release of my very first book, The Golden Key: Modern Alchemy to Unlock Infinite Abundance. If you're ready to alchemize the circumstances in your life so that your abundance expands to an entirely new level in 2021, head over to goldenkey.gift to download the audio or ebook as my gift to you by using the code POSITIVEHEAD. All right, all you positive heads. On this week's Soul Share episode, I'm very excited to have Dean Radin back here with me on the show. Dean is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where he is dedicated to unlocking the scientific understanding of intuition, inspiration, and transformation. Dean was originally on episode 417 way back in 2017, seems like a lifetime ago now, where he discussed his evidence-based approach to exploring consciousness, the findings of his multi-decade journey experimenting and verifying the reality of psychic phenomena. And he is back today to discuss his latest book, among many things, Real Magic, which has remained on the top 50 bestseller list since its release in 2018. Hello, Dean. Welcome back to the show, my friend. Super excited to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So as we kind of kick this off, I typically always start off with the same cliche opener question, and it's always fun to go and see if it's changed at all for people. I think I was still asking this back in 2017, or maybe it might be right before I started. But the question is this: you're in an elevator. The woman next to you looks over, says, "What's your passion?" You have 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
Donuts.
Donuts?
Chocolate-covered donuts.
I like this answer.
Old-fashioned style chocolate, dark chocolate covered
I like
donuts.
this. Well, one of my first jobs was Dunkin' Donuts. So I think you and I are going to do just fine. No wonder we're doing this again.
Excellent.
Water seeks its own level. Oh, man. So I also typically will at this point go into backstory a little bit of my guest. But since you've shared that before, people can go back to episode 417 and hear that. And I'd like to just dive right in and get into, all the things that you've sort of uncovered since we last spoke. And I'm sure there's a lot of ground to try and cover in the little bit of time we have together. If you would, let's start off with real magic. I mean, what do you mean by that term? Are you talking tricks, illusions, Harry Potter magic? What does that mean to you?
So what I mean by real magic is not Harry Potter and not Harry Houdini. So it's not the Harrys.
Not the Harrys. Got it.
No, it's the real stuff. It's the phenomena on which Harry Potter and Harry Houdini are based, and which a large chunk of our entertainment business is based. Mm-hmm. It's the idea that there's some aspects of consciousness that do not appear to be arising out of brain activity, that they are, we use the term non-local, to indicate that part of what we think of as our mind and cognition is probably the result of information processing in the brain. That's pretty clear. But that's not all it is. There's something else going on. So real magic then is about what is the rest of the story about the nature of consciousness and what can it do. That's what that book is about.
Gotcha. And, I think I was really fascinated having you on before because, what's great about your approach is you really are, a scientist. You're taking this, as a chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, you're really looking at this stuff with a scientific lens. And of course, this book being endorsed by 2 Nobel laureates in physics and chemistry. And you really are paving the way for, bringing some. And I think our world is changing a lot, where this sort of stuff that was so sort of looked down on before is now like, hold on, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And, like they say, who was it that said, was it Niels Bohr, I think, who said something to the effect of, if you're not completely spooked by physics, you don't understand what's going on. You're not, something to that effect. And so I'd love to just, start wherever you feel is, an exciting place to start, and what you've uncovered, not only across your career, but, in the years since 2017 when we originally had you on.
Mm-hmm. So part of the motivation for the book Real Magic was in thinking of how do we begin to explain psychic phenomena from a scientific perspective. And it turns out that this is a really important question, because when you talk to scientists who are brought up the same way that I was, through a materialistic worldview, where everything that we know and everything, including ourselves and our consciousness, is assumed to come out of matter and energy, and in our case, out of the brain. Mm-hmm. So if somebody tells you then that they have a perception of something in the future, or they have a telepathic rapport with somebody from a distance, those kinds of phenomena are considered to be impossible, literally impossible, because the materialistic worldview does not know how the brain can get information that's not nearby. The term non-local is referring to the notion that somehow we can get information, both distant in space and also distant in time. So the other thing is that many scientists, and many lay people too, if you start telling them about a psychic experience or laboratory studies confirming that they're actually real effects, the very next question that they ask after you talk about the data is, well, how do you explain that? And the truth is, at this point, from a scientific perspective, we don't know. And that makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. Like, what are you talking about? You're showing there's an effect, but you have no idea how it works? Well, we have a couple of ideas, but we're still very far away from a theoretical explanation that everybody would kind of nod and say, okay, I think I understand what's happening. So with that in mind, both my book, Real Magic, and a previous book I wrote called Supernormal was addressing this issue then. How do we begin to understand human experiences that have been reported throughout history, that have been confirmed in scientific experiments, but are very different from the scientific worldview of today? Mm-hmm. So the way to approach that then is to look in historical terms at times in history when these kinds of issues were not considered to be controversial. In fact, they were mainstream. The idea that people have special abilities like this was completely mainstream, starting from the beginnings of human history to about 500 years ago. And then it changed. And it changed as a result of the development of the scientific method, which made the assumption that the only thing that's real out there is matter and energy. Anything else doesn't even exist. So when you do this exercise and you look back, well, what did people believe before science? And now we're talking about what is today called the esoteric traditions. It's esoteric because it's a kind of worldview that has been suppressed. That's why it's hidden. That's where esoteric comes from. Their worldview is still held by scientists today, certainly by philosophers today, but it is not the mainstream view. And it's called idealism, which is the flip side of materialism. So materialism says everything's made out of matter and energy. Idealism says, no, everything is actually made out of consciousness.
Right.
There's a lot of arguments that mostly that philosophers make as to why this is actually a much better worldview than materialism. I'm not completely convinced by those arguments, but I certainly understand them. And the upshot is that If you want to be somewhere in the middle, like I think I put myself somewhere in the middle of materialism and idealism, then you have another choice, which is called dual aspect monism, or sometimes called neutral monism. And this is a state, this is a position that says, okay, it's very clear that there's a material world out there. Like the physical universe is a thing, and our understanding of the brain is a thing. It's real stuff. On the other hand, it looks like trying to use those methods of understanding the nature of consciousness, and I'm talking here mostly about subjective experience, like the taste of a lemon. We don't know how to account for the subjective taste of a lemon through the neurosciences. It doesn't show up anywhere. We can trace all of the aspects of sensory experience and the neural mechanisms and all the rest of it, but we can't get inside, right? All we can do from a scientific perspective at the moment is to look at things from the outside. But the taste of a lemon is something that's on the inside. So dual aspect monism says there is a real outside, but there's also a real inside. They're both ontologically real things. And so this puts consciousness on either the same footing as matter and energy, or maybe more fundamental. We don't know at this point. But the moment that you entertain the possibility of two quite apparently different kinds of realities, an internal subjective reality and external reality, one of the reasons why scientists generally don't like this idea is because it sounds like dualism. There's two fundamentally different things. Well, how can two fundamentally different things interact with each other? That's been the problem with dualism. So the reason why I call this, not only me, but the reason why the philosophy is called dual aspect monism is because it says there is only one thing. That's what the monism is about. But there are two aspects to it. So the metaphor I like to use in describing this is something like a coin. So a coin has a heads and a tails. When you look at each side, it looks very different. But the nature of the medium itself, they're both there. They're both real. The heads and tails are tightly correlated with each other, but they're different. So mind and matter are tightly correlated, but not the same thing. What this does then, it says that maybe on the mind side, it can do things that are not quite physical, or at least different from physical. On the matter side, physics tells us a lot about the nature of the way the physical world works, but it doesn't tell us anything about how the mental side works. So from using this as a model, then, you can go and look at the esoteric traditions. And the esoteric traditions are all about idealism. They always assumed that consciousness was really the fundamental. And from that position, then, suddenly the notion of psychic phenomena, mystical experiences, and more importantly, magical practice suddenly become viable. Like if we're looking for an explanation, from that point of view, the explanation is very, very simple. The reason why psychic phenomena and magic and those kinds of things work is because consciousness is more fundamental than the physical world, or at least it is as fundamental. So it can do things that you can't do very easily just from a purely material perspective. So that was the motivation in thinking about what do I need to do to come up with an explanation that would be satisfying and is already well understood from a philosophical perspective and a historical perspective. So when you do that, you start looking at psychic phenomena from the point of view of this is simply a way that consciousness interacts with the nature of the physical world. It's not limited by space and time. That's why all of the psychic phenomena are very interesting. Well, in the esoteric world, I can make an analogy here that in the modern technological world, we say that our technologies are a practical application of the scientific worldview. That's what technology is. In the esoteric worldview, magic is an application of the esoteric worldview. It's an application of the way that people imagine the world to work. And so in real magic, I talk about three categories of magic. One is called divination, which is perception through space and time. And there's a million different methods that people use. The second is called force of will, which is all about the application of intention to change aspects of the physical world. In many magical traditions, it's actually kind of destiny engineering. Mm-hmm. It's the idea that you can change your destiny through intention or through various rituals, which are all based on intention. And the third category is called theurgy, which in the esoteric traditions means working with spirits or invisible, non-human something or others.
Entities of some sort.
Entities. So, okay, so there's real magic. It's those three kinds of practices. So the reason why, as a scientist, I find this interesting is because divination is perception through space and time. Well, what else do we call that? We call it clairvoyance, telepathy, and precognition. Those are all about perception through space and time. We know through scientific tests that these kinds of phenomena, meaning the psychic phenomena, are real. That tells us that what the ancients used to call magical methods or divination methods was also real. And they probably had it to a more refined art than we do because they weren't distracted by their smartphones or anything else. So
right.
The second category then is force of will, the idea that your intention can change the world, or the whole domain of affirmations and all that. Well, there's scientific evidence suggesting that our intentions can also change the world. At least it can affect things that you can measure and you can see that there's something happening. So that means that the ancient idea about magical spells is also probably true. The third category about theurgy, the only way that science has been able to test this in any rigorous way is through testing mediums. So mediumship and channeling to a limited extent can be tested under double-blind conditions, and you can verify that mediums are getting accurate information. The problem with mediumship is that we don't actually know where the information comes from. The medium's experience is that they're communicating with a departed loved one or some non-human entity, but they don't really know that. That's their experience. Well, all we can do from a scientific perspective is verify that the information that they get is correct. And so that we can do. But from the very beginning, over 140 years ago, when people started to systematically study mediumship, they recognized almost immediately that, well, maybe the medium is getting the information by telepathy, or maybe clairvoyance, or maybe something else, but not necessarily from a departed entity. So that has not been resolved to this day. We still don't have a very clear way of discriminating between use of psychic ability versus an actual independent entity.
Right. Well, I'd love to hear, I know you've done a lot of experimentation, involving some of them even involving stem cells and, using living things like plants. And so, I'm sure we could have 5 podcasts about all the experiments that you've seen, heard about, or been a part of over the decades. But I'd love to hear, any that you feel would be the most interesting and relevant to share in regards to any of these 3, sort of buckets, if you will. Yeah, love to hear any of those.
Okay, so within the category of force of will, this is all about use of intention and changing the world. We've done a wide variety of studies looking at different kinds of physical targets. And the whole point of these studies is that you deal with a target like water or the growth of a plant or stem cells or a whole bunch of things like that, things out of the external world where you mentally try to change it in some way, and then you measure it and see, did it change? So in the case that you mentioned on stem cells, it actually is part of a long series of studies that have involved, rather than, as some of the experiments I do involve things like photons and electrons and very elementary physics kinds of targets. This series of studies was using things that are more common to people. So one of the first studies involved intentional influence of chocolate. So we got a Mongolian shaman, we got a Buddhist monk to intentionally imprint samples of chocolate with the blessing, essentially, that anybody who ate it would have an elevation in their mood. And we had identical pieces of chocolate that were not blessed. And we did a classic double-blind randomized controlled trial where we recruited people. We gave them the pieces of chocolate. They were blind as to whether it was treated or not. And then each person was asked over a period of a week to fill out a mood reporting scale. This is a standard scale where people report every day what their mood is. And the hypothesis was that people who are getting the mentally treated chocolate would report better mood. And we had a variety of different kinds of controls in there to make sure that the people started out the same and all the other types of controls you'd use. And we found a statistically significant improvement in mood in the people who are eating the treated chocolate. So a colleague of mine then in Taiwan said, that's really interesting. I would like to try to replicate that. But people in Taiwan don't eat much chocolate, so maybe we could use something else. So we decided on tea, because beverage is quite popular, especially tea. Sure. So we used a batch of oolong tea. We made a big batch of oolong tea. We separated it into two batches, one of which was set aside as the control, and the other batch was given to 3 Buddhist monks at a temple in Taiwan, and they were asked to imprint or to bless that tea so that people who drank the tea would report better mood, just like the chocolate study.
Sure.
So we did that. This time we recruited many more people, about 100 in the treated group and 100 in the control group, again, double-blind design. And sure, again, once again, when analyzing the resulting data, the mood of the people getting the oolong tea was better, was improved. Now, what was interesting about that study is we also asked people, do you think you got the blessed tea or not? We wanted to gauge the role of belief in this, because as you are well aware, that placebo effects account for a very large determination of our performance on virtually anything.
Sure.
So we then said, well, okay, since we have this measure then of whether people believe they have the treated tea or not, if you separate the data, what you find is very interesting. You find people who got the treated tea but believe that they did not actually performed the same way as people who got the control tea. They showed no difference. Whereas people who got the treated tea, who did believe that they got a treated tea, had a huge effect.
Wow.
So in terms of percentages, the percentage over the baseline here for people who got the treated tea and believed that that's what they were getting, there's something like over 100% improvement in mood in those people.
Wow.
Whereas the other people who all got the identical tea, they also got treated tea, but they didn't believe it. They were down to the baseline. They had zero improvement in mood.
Wow.
And so what's interesting about this is that this is well known within the magical traditions, that if you are doing a magical practice and you don't believe it's going to work, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
So being open to the possibility that this is going to work is a critical component in the practice of magic, and also, as we found, even in fairly mundane psychic effects, as in this case with the tea.
Yeah.
So
that's really supports. Real quick, if I can interject, that
Sure.
really supports sort of my my analysis over years of sort of playing around with some of this, especially when you talk about will and intention and creating reality in that way. It's Bashar, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the teacher Bashar, who claims to be channeler and talks to entities, and he calls it permission slips. And I sort of agree with that whole notion. It's like creating a container and a permission slip of, okay, here's the circumstance which creates enough of a scenario for you to buy into the idea that you can be affected in this magical way. And therefore, abracadabra, you create as you believe and speak in that case. And it's, really at the end of the day, I think we'll get to the other side and see it was all placebo, and this seems to support that in some way. It's like their belief is the real power as opposed to the permission slip of, oh, this thing happened, this process happened to it, or what have you.
Mhm. And there's a long line. There's 70 years of experiments in parapsychology that are called the sheep-goat experiments. And this is all about, what do you believe? So the sheep-goat experiment is, take any kind of experiment, a simple card test or something like that, with a classroom that's going to participate. And you first separate the classroom into people who believe that ESP is likely to be real and people who don't believe it. And they all take exactly the same test. And then afterwards, you can make a prediction that the people who are open to the idea that ESP is real, they will do significantly better than the people who don't believe it. So you can see this permission slip is one way of thinking about it. Another way is that our belief is a way of opening and closing blinders to what we're going to be perceiving. And we can easily shut blinders because we don't believe something, and then you won't see it. It's not part of your reality anymore. And we see this even in things like politics, where we have this big political divide that we're dealing with now. And it's not that people are stupid. What happens is that they believe different things, and therefore they see different things.
Right.
So this is just part of the way that we are. We can manipulate what we are aware of by virtue of what we decide to believe. So when I work with participants in experiments, I will sometimes say that even if you don't believe that this stuff is real, make believe you're at a movie and you're setting aside your disbelief. I mean, you have to do that in a movie. Otherwise, why bother to go see the movie?
Right.
So it's very similar when you're doing an experiment. You have to set aside your disbelief long enough to just go ahead and do the experiment, and maybe keep an open attitude as to what you're going to see. And afterwards, if you want to snap back into a position where you don't believe anything, that's your prerogative, but don't do that during the experiment.
Right.
Okay, so we did the experiment with chocolate, we did it with tea, and then my colleague said, I wonder if we can see an objective change as a result of these blessings, because the chocolate and the tea both had to do with mood. So we decided, okay, let's try an experiment where we grow a plant with water that has been blessed versus the same water that has not been blessed. So we chose a little plant, which is very well understood, called Arabidopsis thaliana, which comes out of the mustard family. It's a little weed-like plant, but its genome was fully sequenced before the human genome. So we know this is like a model plant that plant physiologists use for all kinds of studies. And also there's a whole range of different kinds of mutations that are known about these plants. So the reason why we chose a plant is not only would we be able to measure differences in growth, but all living things have a protein called cryptochrome. And cryptochrome is now thought to have quantum properties. Cryptochrome in the retina of birds is thought to be the reason why birds are able to navigate using the Earth's magnetic field, because they can literally see the magnetic field, and it's like a highway in the sky. It's one of the reasons, one of the ways that we know this is that when there's a magnetic storm, the solar winds will hit the magnetosphere and cause it to shake, and that's a storm. The birds will get lost when there's a magnetic storm because their highway has been disrupted. Wow. So during days of quiet magnetic field, the highway is pretty stable, and they see it and they can get to where they want to go. So we decided to use a plant because it has not only cryptochrome, including humans have cryptochrome too, but it appears to have quantum properties, that's why it is so exquisitely sensitive to the magnetic field. And it's in the plant too. And more importantly, there's a mutation of this Arabidopsis plant that makes it overexpress anything having to do with cryptochrome. And so we thought, well, that would be an interesting target, because in fact, if it's a quantum phenomenon going on as a protein inside this plant, and we have a mutation which makes it express even more, maybe that plant would be very sensitive to intention. Because the idea that observation in quantum mechanics is a central component of quantum mechanics. So we did the experiment again. It was a double-blind trial, and the same Buddhist monks in Taiwan blessed the water. And the results showed that for the mutation, the cryptochrome mutation plants, very, very significant changes in growth. So the blessing was to make it grow more. And in fact, we saw several different measures of how plants grow, all grew much more, statistically speaking, much more than the plants that got the control water. So after we did that study, we decided to do yet another one, this time with human stem cells. And like every living thing, they have cryptochrome as well. But we figured that stem cells are interesting because, as you may know, there's a big controversy about using embryonic stem cells versus using adult stem cells. So one of the places you can get adult stem cells is in dental pulp. So you have a tooth extracted, you can go into the pulp and you can grow stem cells out of the pulp. That's what we did. The problem with those kinds of stem cells is that they're difficult to grow and they're difficult to keep alive in a state called stemness, which is the pluripotent state where they can then turn to other kinds of cells. It's hard to keep these adult stem cells in those states. So in this case, what we wanted to see is, could we make the growth of stem cells in a growth medium that was made out of this blessed water? Would they simply grow better? Would we have a more proliferation of these stem cells? And to make a long story short, the answer is yes. They grew better. They showed genetic expression, which is consistent with the idea that they were healthier and would last longer. So this study was done partially just out of curiosity to see if it would work, but also has pragmatic implications in that the consciousness of the people around the stem cells seems to influence the way that they work, and they grew better. So we're always interested in living targets that are super sensitive to different kinds of influences, and so the stem cells are certainly one kind of target that does that. So that was the last experiment of that type that we just published it a few months ago.
Fascinating. Have you done experiments that are more geared towards exploring divination or working with, entities of some kind?
Well, on the entity side, I've participated in experiments where we've done both neuroscience on mediums and also asked them to look at pictures of people who are either alive or dead at the time. Well, of course, the pictures were taken when they were alive, but at the time they did the experiment, about half of the people were dead. So we wanted to check on an ability that some mediums say that they have, that they could just glance at a picture and they know immediately if the person's alive or dead. So we did that experiment. We got pictures of people. We knew if they were alive or dead. All the pictures were uniform and that there weren't obvious differences between them. And the mediums did significantly better than chance in saying, yeah, this person's dead or this person is alive. We then did a follow-up experiment where we wanted to know not if they were dead or alive, pictures of people, all of whom were dead, but how did they die? And so there are 3 or 4 different categories. We asked the mediums to see if they can tell how they died. And we also asked people who are not mediums, controls. What we found overall, both the mediums and controls combined, was a significant accuracy that they were able to tell how they died. But curiously, the controls actually did better than the mediums.
Wow.
So this was a little curious. And talking to the mediums, we generally find that when a medium is given a task, which is not the sort of thing that they're used to doing, they feel pressure to perform. And if there's anything we've learned about these experiments is that the moment that anxiety enters the picture, performance begins to drop. Gotcha. Whereas the controls are just, they're guessing.
No expectation, no, any win is win.
Yeah, and for them, it was just a fun game. I mean, it's kind of a morbid idea of the game, but nevertheless, they weren't being tested for their special skills. So Well, so that was interesting. That's about as much as I've personally done. I have my colleagues are looking into these kinds of things more than I am.
Interesting.
In terms of divination, some years ago, I started a form of an experiment called Presentament, which is a way of looking at how we unconsciously respond to future events. And this, like most of my experiments, they start with stories. So the story in this case is a guy I knew who liked to go hunting. And so he had lots of guns. And one day he said he was cleaning a double action 6-shot revolver. And so in a double action revolver, as you pull the trigger, the cylinder turns, the hammer goes back, and then the hammer hits the next cylinder. And so that's why you can just keep pulling the trigger and shoot all 6 of the bullets. So he took all the bullets out, he's cleaning the gun. Now he's putting the bullets back in. And he would used to leave the chamber number 6 empty with the hammer over that just for safety's sake, so it couldn't accidentally hit anything. But now he's putting in bullet into chamber number 5, and he got a really bad feeling. And he didn't know what it meant. He just said, I don't know, there's something wrong with this bullet or something. He left it out. So now there are 4 bullets and 2 empty chambers.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of weeks goes by, he's out hunting with a bunch of friends. They come back to the cabin and they start drinking, which you should not do if there's lots of guns around.
Sure.
So a fight breaks out between 2 of the guys there. One of them picks up his gun, points it directly at the face of the guy he's angry at, which is not my friend, but another person. And my friend tries to intervene by getting in between them, but it was too late because the other guy was already pulling the trigger. You could see the hammer go back. You could see the cylinder turn, and it went click instead of bang because it hit the 5th chamber. And the 5th chamber was the one that had the bullet in it that he took out.
Wow.
So that's a dramatic example of a bad feeling, his presentiment, that there's something bad about this bullet. I should set it aside. So that it saved his life in this case. So what I did is I came up with a way of simulating that kind of event in the laboratory that's not going to put people in actual danger, but has a similar kind of emotional event. So you sit somebody down in front of a computer screen, you wire them up to look at some aspect of their physiology, like skin conductance or pupil dilation or heartbeat or something like that. Sometimes we measured all of them. And then on the screen, what they see every so often is a picture. So the picture could be very calm, like a placid lake or an empty vase, things like that. And every so often, randomly, a picture would come up that was very emotional, like a picture of a gun pointing directly at you, or a picture of a car exploding, or a picture of a surgery, or something like that. So we have these calm pictures, we have emotional pictures, completely random sequence. Nobody knows in advance what that sequence is. In fact, we even used a truly random number generator so that even in principle, nobody would know. And so the program would work such that it's recording your physiology continuously. It gets to a point where it's going to show a picture at that point. It makes a random decision, selects it from a large pool of pictures and shows it. And typically it's on the screen for 3 to 5 seconds and then it goes away and then you calm down. So you do this kind of cycle maybe 30 or 40 times in one session, and then you're done. So you do this for many subjects, and then the analysis is looking at how are you physiologically just before a calm picture as compared to just before an emotional picture. Because what we would predict is that if you can somehow feel what your future emotion is, then you would be responding differently physiologically than if you were feeling that the future is about to be calm. And that's exactly what we found. And so I started doing these studies in the mid-90s. I did a bunch of them. My colleagues started doing them. And as of today, there's maybe 4 dozen, I think, published experiments like this, using lots of different kinds of measures, physiological measures. And it's very clear that this is a real effect. It's a very interesting study to do because you're not asking anybody to be psychic.
Right.
You're measuring their unconscious response to an emotional event that is about to occur. And it might be calm and it might be emotional. And there's a difference. People respond differently before these 2 kinds of events, which is somewhat of a confirmation, as many of our experiments are, that when people tell you a story, like the one I told you about my friend with the gun, that there might be a psychic component to that. Like he had an unconscious revulsion about this one bullet that didn't make any sense to him until 2 weeks later when he realized to his horror that it could have killed him.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really fascinating phenomenon. And I'm curious, do you find, that every subject, no matter who they are, is responding, or is it like a percentage, is responding to the emotional image and, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, or is it like consistent?
People have idiosyncratic responses to pictures. So that's one thing that adds noise to the experiment. If you were a herpetologist and you saw a picture of a snake, you'd probably get warm fuzzies because you know that snake. If you're not a herpetologist, you're going to jump because people don't like snakes. And this is true across the board. Somebody will look at a picture of a placid lake and have a huge emotional reaction because they almost drowned in a lake one day.
Right.
So that's why we need lots of trials from lots of people in order to get through the noise. The noise begins to average out after a while. And we know that on average, people respond to certain pictures in certain ways. And there's an international standardized set of pictures in which there are ratings of how emotional the picture is and also whether it's positive or negative, separately for men and for women. There's also sets for gay men and gay women because sometimes there are erotic pictures. So these are international sets that are used for studies involving emotion. And those are the kinds of things that we use in these experiments. The other thing is that we know that people have different natural capacities for psychic awareness, even at an unconscious level. So some people will do really, really well on these studies, and others will show little to no effect at all, which is yet another reason why you have to run a whole bunch of people so that you'd be able to see on average what is happening. And if you're able to select out the people who are doing really well, you get a much stronger effect.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I love that study. I think I remember you mentioning that one before because, just like you said, it's not asking someone to, to demonstrate their psychic ability. It's just monitoring what happens. And,
right.
it makes it very interesting for that reason. I'm curious, have you ever seen, I'm curious what you think about like faith healing and this sort of thing. So there is a really interesting, performance of this guy named Darren Brown. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him or not, but there's a Netflix special called Miracle, Faith or Fiction. And he basically reinvents the concept of faith healing through a series of stunts that he kind of is like mocking the religious aspect of faith healing and then simultaneously performing, what appears to be miracles of, creating a permission slip, a container where people go from, not being able to read without their glasses to reading perfectly, or scrambling up their vision, or, just different, they have all this pain and can't walk, and now all of a sudden they can walk. So it's a very interesting show because, like I said, he's sort of mocking the religious aspect and then turning around as a illusionist, I guess, or magician kind of figure, showing some of these things supposedly happen. Of course, as the audience member, you're always thinking, okay, is the audience in on this? And, all those sorts of thoughts. So I'm really curious if you're even familiar with this at all, and in what you think about this phenomenon.
Well, Darren Brown is a world-class mentalist. He's a person who specializes in simulating psychic effects. And many mentalists also are pretty expert in hypnosis, including stage hypnosis. And it's undeniable that if you, especially in a context of a show, the placebo effect and hypnotic effects are very, very strong in some people. Yeah. So a good hypnotist can very quickly discover whether or not you're open to suggestion or not. And if you are open to suggestion, given the additional demand of being in public and not wanting to let the magician down, The combination of both of those can produce all kinds of very interesting effects in the way that people behave. And in many ways, it's a little bit like the placebo effect on steroids.
Right.
It's you're manipulating what people believe, and just like simple things like we feel pain as a result of pretty much what we believe. If you're convinced that you don't have pain and you're a very good hypnotic subject, you won't feel any. I mean, there are demonstrations where you can push a knitting needle through your hand, and it not only doesn't feel any pain, you may not have any blood.
Yeah.
So these are considered so outrageous that many people don't even believe it, but nevertheless, it's true. There's a lot of evidence that, for example, for Sufis who go into ecstatic states, they can do all kinds of things with knitting needles through their body, and there's hardly any pain and there's no scars. So these are on the far edge of what happens when you're able to manipulate what people believe. And it's, of course, again, completely consistent with what we see with the sheep-goat effect and with lots of different kinds of psychic studies. The question then, though, is how far can you push it? So can you push somebody to the level where they now think that they're levitating? Are they really levitating? Well, I don't know of any cases where a stage magician has been able to hypnotize somebody to walk off the edge of the stage and then they don't fall.
Right.
So we can do a certain amount of significant changes within the body, but to make it counter what we see as physical law in a large scale sense, we don't see that. In a smaller scale sense, like we're using very sensitive systems as part of our physical target, there haven't been enough studies to know with any certainty whether manipulating somebody's belief a lot would produce a big effect. But I wouldn't be too surprised if we would see some difference as a result of manipulating somebody's belief.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that because I have a friend who, and of course I wasn't there. I have no verification of this, but claims years ago that she was able to, with a group of people, successfully perform levitation. And, her and her group of friends supposedly just like were trying this for an extended period of time, and then they had some level of success. Like I said, I have no verification or anything, but it's really, it does lead you to think. It's like you said, where is the line? Is it if all of a sudden, well, this is a question for you. This is a good question. So if all of a sudden every man, woman, and child on planet Earth believed without a doubt humans absolutely they can fly, do you think, based off of everything that you've seen, that would be enough to disrupt the laws of physics that as we know them now? Would the conscious, container, the field that is created from that belief, do you think it would overpower the laws of physics as we know them that say that is not possible?
Well, I would say maybe one day a week I would believe that for a couple of hours. But the rest of the week and most of the other hours, I would say probably not. And that is, it's working under this philosophical set of assumptions of dual aspect monism, where the physical world is really out there. It really does have certain regularities and laws that enable us to figure out how the universe works. And on the mental side, we don't know what the limits are.
Yeah.
So the problem with your scenario is getting everybody in the world to believe the same thing at the same time.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen. You can't get two people together to believe the same thing at the same time.
Right.
So the closest that we are able to do experiments of the sort that you're saying, there are two different classes. One are experiments that have been done by the transcendental meditation people who have put meditators in a city and then measured that when the meditators were doing their thing, the crime statistics would go down.
Right. In Washington, D.C., there was a big one, right?
Yeah. So there's something like 40 experiments that have been done over years, and it looks like it works. Yeah. It hasn't convinced very many people who hear about this. They don't know if they should believe it or not. I kind of believe it. Yeah. The second category is an experiment that we've been running now for over 2 decades called the Global Consciousness Project. And that shows interesting effects as well, suggesting that a collective, coherent attention of very large groups of people will change aspects of the physical world that we can measure. And so that experiment started in 98. It's continuing to today. The formal experiment involved 500 world events, like 9/11, a gigantic tsunami that killed 100,000 people, the death of celebrities, those kinds of big, big events that enormous number of people are watching, typically live. So the physical targets that we have in this case are not things that people are aware of, because they don't, I mean, when you're watching a funeral of some famous person, you don't know that you're involved in an experiment, but in fact, there is an experiment running. We have electronic random number generators located in major cities around the world. We're monitoring them all the time. We have very well understood and systematic ways of seeing how does the random behavior of all these different random generators, how is it working when no big events are occurring, as compared to when some big thing happens and a lot of people suddenly coalesce their attention. And so after 500 major events like that, you can come up with a statistical estimate of, did it change? Was there any difference? And the answer is yeah, there was a difference to the tune of odds against chance of 3 trillion to 1.
Wow.
And so what that means is that during periods where collective mind is paying attention to the same thing, sort of metaphorically, like they're on the same wavelength.
Yep.
The nature of randomness in the world itself is becoming less random.
Yeah.
That's what the generators are telling us, that they're less random when people are doing this large scale thing. What we don't know from that experiment is, what if everybody was not only paying attention, but paying intention at the same time? Well, there have been a few episodes in history where something like that happened that weren't part of experiments. But one example could be something like when Apollo 13 had an explosion on board, and basically everybody in the world simultaneously was praying like crazy that it would come back to Earth safely. And if you know the history of all that, it went through a whole series of like impossible things that actually got everybody back, got the astronauts back to Earth safely. Whereas it could have easily have a million things gone wrong and it could have still be out there in space somewhere or blown up.
Yeah.
So it would be hard to do an experiment on a very large scale like this that involved intention, because the closest that we have to this today are things like large scale meditations for peace. Well, those are perfectly fine things to do, except that how would we know if peace was occurred? That, you know, were we successful? Does everybody have the same idea of what peace means? Generally, no. So we could do experiments like this, these large-scale intention experiments, and some have been done. The effects generally are not gigantic. No, we don't see people levitating. We see similar effects like we can see in the laboratory where only a few people are doing the experiment. So what we're talking about here does not appear to scale up. If you have 1 million people doing something, you don't get an effect that's 1 million times bigger. You get it a little bit bigger, but the creating like a pure coherence among many people is very, very difficult to do. And I think that's the reason why we don't tend to see a scaling effect when you have a lot of people doing something.
Yeah, you make me think. I have a friend of a friend who years back was going to do and went really far down the path of creating a prayer app where people could, ask for prayers and, monitor their sort of results simultaneously. And he didn't end up releasing it because he got kind of spooked after getting contacted by the government, basically giving him options about what he could or couldn't do with it and their involvement. And it just kind of like, oh, whoa, okay, never mind. And so I thought that was it was a really interesting. I'm not even going into a lot of the details that I heard just because, it's like one of those things where it's just like, it was enough to have him just put the whole thing down. And I know you were a part of some U.S. government classified Stargate stuff, which was psychic espionage. And I don't know if it had like remote viewing involved, but I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, I was a visiting scientist for 1 year on the Stargate program before it had that code word, because it had many code words over the years. I was on it when the code word is called Grill Flame. That was simply the name of the project.
Hmm.
So it was when the Army portion of Stargate began, or within about a year of it beginning. So that was a shift from pure research into operational missions. So I wasn't involved in the operational missions. That was all done through the Army. I was on the research side, where a large part of what we were doing, as they do today with UFOs, was to assess whether or not the reports are a threat.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you want to get government money to do something, you just convince somebody that we're under attack.
Yeah,
We have
right.
to worry whether there's something to threaten our security, and then you can get lots of money. So these programs were partially to look at reports coming from other countries that were claiming that they had psychic something or other, and decide, is this a threat? Is it real or not? So
Right.
we looked at reports that had been spirited out of other countries by people who were defecting to the United States, who had been said that they were been working on these sorts of things. And in some cases, we tried to replicate effects that people had talked about. And also, a large part of it was looking at, we know that some people are extremely talented in remote viewing. Those are the ones that tend to end up working for law enforcement or the government in some way. Why are they different? And can you train somebody? Take Joe Sixpack off the street, and can you train them to become really good at this? So we learned pretty quickly that you can train people. You can take an average person and train them to get a little bit better than they were before. In the same way that if somebody doesn't know anything about playing tennis, if you give
Yeah.
them a couple of introductory lessons, they'll get better,
Yeah.
but they won't go to Wimbledon
Right.
ever. Whereas some people you can learn very quickly are talented, and they will go to Wimbledon if they keep practicing at it because they have natural talent. It's the
Yeah.
same in this domain.
Yep.
So we didn't find any particular markers, physiological or psychological or otherwise, that said, yeah, if you find the person that is like this, they're likely to have talent. But times have changed, and the methods that we have available now, which is one of the projects that I've been working on for a couple of years, is to see if there's a genetic difference.
Mm.
And the reason why this comes about is because every culture in the world throughout history has made a claim that there are people who are psychic who come from psychic families.
Right.
And so that suggests that there's a genetic component. So we did a study where we recruited candidates from around the world who said that they were psychic and came from psychic families. And we gave them tests to verify if they had any ability. And we made sure they weren't psychotic and all that. And then we got their DNA, of course, by their permission. And we then found people who were controls who did not claim any psychic abilities, and no one in their family was psychic, and they were willing to give their DNA. And then we did a bunch of comparison tests between the psychics and the controls, and we found a difference. So we're talking about whenever you're looking for differences in talent, there's some things that are pretty easy to find. So like, with 23andMe and Ancestry.com and those kinds of things, one of the things that you can find out is your type of muscle twitch. And based on that, which is a genetic component, you can tell whether somebody's likely to be better as a sprinter versus a marathon runner. And the difference between the two is such that if your muscles are the kind that are fast twitching, which would make you a good sprinter, you would die in a marathon, and vice versa. So these are natural genetic traits that we have. Well, we found one that seems to be related to psychic talent. To know if what we found was true or not, you need to do many replications, and it's still kind of expensive to do these tests. So we've been dealing with both raising money to be able to test thousands of people. There are ways of looking at the relationship among thousands of genes. And this is probably where we're going to end up, to find that there really is a difference in psychic ability. It's probably a constellation of thousands of different genes. And the reason why I say that is because there have been studies to look at variations in fairly subtle ways that intelligence expresses itself. So one form of intelligence is called crystalline, and the other form is, crystalline and flexible. So crystalline intelligence is somebody who's like superior mathematician, thinks extremely analytically and very precisely, whereas flexible intelligence is someone who ends up being highly creative. So they both can have the same level of intelligence as measured by standardized intelligence scale, but is expressed differently. And it turns out that there is a genetic underpinning there. It involves hundreds and hundreds of genes in both cases, but there is a difference. So something as subtle as psychic ability probably falls into that class, that there may be 100 or 1,000 genes interacting in such a way that you either have psychic talent or you don't. So we have the tools to do this now. What we don't have is the money. So if a billionaire is listening, we only need $1 million to actually run this with a sample size large enough to know with any certainty that there really is a genetic difference or not.
Wow, really interesting. And it sounds like it's a little more complex than the sprinter marathon comparison, right?
Yes, it's much more complex.
Yeah. You're talking about, like you said, a constellation of genetic, signatures. And then, of course, you get into, epigenetics, right? And this idea of turning genes off and on, I suppose, puts a whole nother factor, into the equation as well, right?
Yeah, well, so the epigenetics probably figure in on terms of how belief modulates these abilities.
Yeah.
Right. So as I think it was Norman Lear who expressed this phrase that belief becomes biology. Right. So the placebo effect kind of is that you really, really believe something, you can change your physical structure, or your whole system, your whole body will change as a result of the belief. So belief becomes biology. In this case, belief may act as a trigger, an epigenetic trigger, for turning on abilities that you may not have even known that you had.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, that really lends to the consciousness, leads ahead of the materialism in a sense, because you have the one really affecting the other in such a profound way.
Yeah. Of course, when these effects are detected in the body, it's much more, it's difficult to know what's causing what.
Yeah,
because the body's so flexible. But one of the reasons why many of the experiments that I do in this domain are physics-oriented experiments is because a target is not a living system. It's a hunk of physical stuff that is generally considered to be inanimate. And so if you can show that there's a relationship between what your intention is, or even what your attention is, and the change in a physical system, provides much stronger evidence that there really is a relationship between consciousness and its role in the physical world.
Yeah. You conducted an experiment to test energy medicine like Reiki and therapeutic touch as well, correct?
Yes. We worked with how many? 19, I think, 19 different kinds of energy medicine healers and about 190 participants, all of whom had carpal tunnel syndrome. And so each person had a half an hour healing session with one of the healers, only one of the healers. And to get 190 people, we had to use a lot of healers. So we measured things like subjective pain and changes in water that was put in the vicinity of the healers. And we had random number generators going. And we found changes in all of it. So very significant changes in terms of the pain that people reported. So that's like the first thing you would hope to find in these techniques. That we then did a 3-week follow-up, and people still reported a significant change even after 3 weeks. After a half an hour of a treatment where they had been suffering from carpal tunnel pain for a long time. So we also asked about their expectations to see if there was due to a placebo effect, and overall their expectations were not very good. They didn't think it was going to work because nothing else was working, and yet they had a reduction in pain. So, so the energy medicine technique, however it works, and we don't really know how it works, it did something. We also saw changes in the structure, the molecular structure of water that was on a necklace inside a little aliquot around the neck of the healer and also around the neck of the client. And so what we saw was a significant change around the water of the healer, but not on the client. So again, we don't know exactly why that happened, but that is what happened. I mean, and again, we also saw a change in the random number generators during the healing sessions. We saw more order appear in the random generators than you would expect by chance.
Interesting. I'm curious, you mentioned, since you mentioned UFOs, I'm curious what your analysis and thoughts are in regards to that phenomenon.
Well, of course, I think like everyone else, I have no idea what they are. That there is something certainly seems to be the case. I've been tracking this domain for decades, mainly through people I know who have been very deeply involved in it, both inside and outside of the government. So I've been convinced for many years that there's something going on, but what the something is, as best as I can tell, nobody knows. What's interesting is that it has an overlap then with the kind of research I do on consciousness. There does seem to be some element of consciousness involved in these objects and also in the way that people interact with entities said to come from the objects and so on. Exactly what it all means at this point, how do we interpret it? I don't know. I don't know anybody who, no, actually, I take it back. I know plenty of people who say with high confidence that they know exactly what's going on, but I'm not persuaded by any of that because you have conflicting reports from people who are totally convinced that they know what the truth is. And if you have two people giving you different reports, both of whom are highly confident about it, then something is wrong. Something's being missed somewhere.
Yeah.
So the element that consciousness is involved is seen, for example, when the pilot who is chasing or being chased by a UFO gets the idea that they're going to suddenly accelerate and see if they can capture the thing. The instant that thought comes to mind, the object changes. So it's almost as though it is telepathically picking up what's happening. It's somehow knowing in a way that doesn't involve a physical effect, but it seems to involve a mental effect. So,
right.
It's just it'll add it onto our large pile of mysteries yet to be solved.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's certainly a lot of those. And I'm curious if you have any particular story that comes to mind. I always like to ask for a story of synchronicity or serendipity or a positive paranormal story. And I'm just curious if there's any particular story that you've personally been involved with that you would care to share.
So I use the following story in my book, Real Magic, because it's the strangest synchronicity that I've ever had, and even stranger than many other synchronicities that I've heard about, and maybe even provides a clue as to how a synchronicity works. So the story is, and again, this is in the book, it's in more detail than I'll say right now. This was back in the year 2000 when I was living in Silicon Valley and with a bunch of friends was creating a nonprofit to study psi research. So we created this thing. This was in early 2000 was the height of the .com craze, and Silicon Valley was really hot at the time. It was hard to find a place to have an office, but we eventually found one sort of out in the periphery in Los Altos. And this was an apartment complex, like a strip mall, but mostly offices of real estate people and dentists and that sort of thing. So we found a nice office there. And I was living at close enough to be able to walk to work. So I would walk to the office in a certain way every day. About a month after I was walking to work in one way, I decided to walk a slightly different way. So I was passing offices that I had not seen before. And I noticed to my surprise that right next to our office was another office with a little sign on the door or next to the door that said SciQuest Labs, which I thought, well, this is what an interesting coincidence, because we're doing cyber search and there's somebody who has the word SciQuest in as part of their thing. So afterwards, for the next couple of weeks, I was walking to work that way again to pass and see if I could see somebody in there, and I would introduce myself. I'm your neighbor. There's this strange coincidence, all that, but there was never anybody there. It was like empty. So one day I walked to work and I pass an office, and I happened to notice that in this office, the sign said SciQuest Inc. So now I was thinking, okay, so some kind of Personnel Services Incorporated or something has a laboratory which next to me. And so now I was thinking, now I'm really curious. So again, every day I check a couple times every day to see if somebody's in there. Finally, I see movement in that office, and they had mini blinds, so you couldn't really see very well what was going on, but I could see somebody was in there. So I knock on the door. The door opens, and I say, "Hello, I'm your neighbor. And I'm about to say my name, and he says, the man who opens the door says, with a kind of a shocked look on his face, he says, "Dean Radin?" And I have never seen this guy before. I have no idea who it is, and he looks seriously shocked, like he's having a heart attack or something. And so to make a long story short, he was doing SciQuest, was a commercial Sci research outfit that no one had ever heard about before. I certainly didn't. None of my colleagues had ever heard about this place. A commercial outfit doing Sci research, like us, next door to us, unbeknownst to any of us. So after we both get over this coincidence, I asked him, well, why were you so shocked when I opened the door? And the answer was that he had been spending the last couple of days doing a yogic dream yoga, actually a Tibetan dream yoga practice, which is a manifestation practice. And the way that it works is you stay up for 3 hours and you hold a strong intention to get what you want. And then you go to sleep for 3 hours and you try to hold the intention in the dream. And you do this for 24 hours in a row. So you're up, you're sleeping, wake, and you get into a really weird state after a while when you're doing this, all the time holding this intention. So I said, well, what's your intention? His intention was to have me show up.
Wow.
And so I said, well, first of all, I was thinking, well, what are you talking about? I think I have free will. I don't feel. So after I recovered from that, I said, well, why did you want me to show up? Well, he wanted me to be on his board of advisors, but he had no way of knowing how to contact me. He only knew me from my books. Had no idea that I was in Silicon Valley. Very few people did.
Wow.
So I said, okay, well, that's an interesting coincidence. And he said, would you like to see my lab? Yeah. So we go next door and we see a laboratory, and this is my chance to fall over, because what I had been doing in my office, which is the wall adjacent to his laboratory.
Right.
That's the office that I had selected. I had a whiteboard up on the wall there, and I was drawing a laboratory that I wanted to build for our offices. And that's what his laboratory was. It was a certain kind of shielded room. It had certain kind of equipment in it, a special kind of chair. All the stuff that I had been drawing on my whiteboard was on the other side of the wall. And he didn't use the lab very much. So I couldn't hear anything through there. It was, like, what is happening here? Wow. So there are multiple levels of synchronicities here, but both of them involving very strong and clear intention. His intention was to make me show up. I did. My intention was to get a laboratory of a certain type. And I did. It was on the other side of the wall, and I didn't even know it. So the clue that it provides then for this story is that it's almost as though intention warps space-time, a little bit like gravity. And so if you have two people who are polling with a certain intention, that just like a moon will orbit another planet because of gravity, it's as though the two people now are part of some kind of a dance where they're pulled together and eventually will collide. We collided when I finally opened the door, and he opened the door, and we discovered what was going on here. So that was a pretty strange synchronicity.
Wow. That's an incredible synchronicity.
Yeah.
What?
So I use that in my book because I have a chapter on magical practices and affirmations. And I ask the question, is any of this stuff real? Like, does intention really do stuff like this? So I use that story as a real life example of the kind of very strange events that can somehow get pulled together, and we call them synchronicities.
Wow. That is quite the story, and what a way to end this episode. So much information and insight, and I just so value your approach to exploring all of this stuff. And it's been such a pleasure to have you on. And I know some of the listeners would like to continue to follow your work. And what is the best way for them to do that?
Well, two ways. One is deanradin.com, my personal website, and the other way is noetic.org, which is the Institute of Noetic Sciences website, and noetic.org, noetic.org.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, I do have one final question for you, and it is this. In 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life, according to Dean Radin?
Old-fashioned, dark chocolate-covered donuts.
I love it. Well said. You bookended that with the donuts, and who knows? Maybe I'll get, or some of the listeners will get an incredible chocolate donut synchronicity. Maybe someone will come knock on their door and deliver one to them. And
I predict that will happen.
We will
put your intention on getting a really, really fine donut, and it will appear.
Chocolate, old fashioned, to be exact.
Well, ideally, but let's not go overboard, right? So anything that is donut shaped and edible, that's going to it'll show up.
Fair enough. I'm ready for it, and we'll be in touch to let you know how that goes. And thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure having you on once again, and all of you out there for tuning in your beautiful brainwaves and incredible hearts. Until next time, journey well. Also, before we sign off, I wanted to remind you to download the Golden Key audio or ebook as my free gift to you at goldenkey.gift using the Golden Key code POSITIVEHEAD. And please, if you enjoy my gift, leave a positive review on Amazon so others can find the book and unlock their lives with the help of the Golden Key as well.